Picture this. You're a medieval villager, and life is a series of never-ending toils. One of your main concerns? Food. In the Middle Ages, a stable food supply was about as likely as a dragon showing up at your door with a pizza. It was a constant struggle between your crops, the weather, and an occasional plague of locusts. So why did you need to worry about being buried alive? Well, during times of famine, people were often so weakened by hunger that they could fall into a deep, coma-like state. To the untrained eye, which was pretty much every eye back then, you'd look dead. No pulse? Check. No visible breathing? Check. Cold as last night's gruel? Check. Into the ground you go! Families, too preoccupied with their own survival, often mistook these states for death. After all, when you're that hungry, waiting around to double-check isn't a top priority. As you lie there, barely clinging to life, your loving relatives might just toss you in the family plot, thinking they're giving you a peaceful rest. And let's not forget the village undertaker, eager to get his job done quickly. His motto? When in doubt, dig it out. He wasn't about to wait for a second opinion from a doctor, mainly because medieval doctors were about as reliable as a weather forecast from a cat. Imagine living in the Middle Ages when plagues and epidemics were the surprise guests that no one wanted. These unwelcome visitors would sweep through towns, turning bustling markets into ghost towns faster than you could say bubonic. When the Black Death came knocking, people panicked. The bodies piled up faster than the local gravediggers could keep up. In their haste to control the spread of the disease, they often buried the sick along with the dead. If you had the misfortune of catching a nasty plague and falling into a deep, death-like sleep, your neighbors might just mistake your snooze for eternal rest. Plague doctors, with their ominous beaked masks, were supposed to be the experts. But with their limited knowledge, they were more likely to diagnose you with a case of the plague and order a swift burial. Their motto, better safe than sorry, better buried than contagious. Add to this the fear and superstition surrounding the plagues. People believed these diseases were punishments from the heavens or curses from witches. The priority was to get the dead out of sight, out of mind, and out of the way of infecting others. Speed was of the essence and caution was thrown to the wind. The Middle Ages, a time when medical instruments were more likely to be found in your kitchen than in a doctor's bag. Imagine getting a checkup with tools that resembled your gardening kit. Forget stethoscopes and thermometers. We're talking about sticks and stones, literally. Diagnosing death was as tricky as medieval politics. Without our modern marvels like ECG machines or even a trusty mirror to check for breath, folks had to rely on the old-fashioned poke and hope method. If you were unfortunate enough to fall into a coma or deep sleep, medieval medical experts might declare you dead faster than you could say misdiagnosis. Picture this. The village healer, with a beard as wild as his medical theories, leans over your seemingly lifeless body. He checks your pulse with the enthusiasm of a cat staring at a cucumber, and feeling nothing gives a solemn nod. Yep, he's a goner. And just like that, your name is added to the list of the dearly departed. But wait, there's more! The absence of embalming and proper refrigeration meant bodies needed to be buried quickly to avoid the not-so-pleasant aroma of decomposition. No one wanted a stinky situation on their hands, so off to the graveyard you went, sometimes while still breathing softly in your unintended nap. Medieval medical instruments might have been crude, but they were consistently bad at distinguishing the living from the dead. So, if you found yourself in the unfortunate position of being prematurely pronounced deceased, you'd better hope your neighbors were late risers when they came to pay their last respects. The Middle Ages was a time when superstitions ran wilder than a medieval feast after a successful harvest. People believed in everything from witches and werewolves to curses and malevolent spirits. If someone in the village fell into a deep sleep or coma, it wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a supernatural crisis. Imagine you've had a particularly exhausting day of tilling the fields and you collapse into a coma. Your neighbors, armed with nothing but a plethora of superstitions, gather around. One look at your motionless body, and the verdict is in. You've been cursed, possessed, or worse, turned into some kind of nocturnal creature. The fear and suspicion spread faster than a rumor at court. The local wise woman, read amateur sorceress, might be called in to perform a diagnosis. With her arsenal of charms, herbs, and dramatic flair, she'd declare you dead, not because you lacked a pulse, but because your spirit had been taken by evil forces. The only solution? Bury you immediately to prevent the curse from spreading. Superstitions didn't stop there. Many believed that the dead could rise again as vampires or ghouls. To prevent such a horrifying event, villagers often opted for a swift burial, hoping to trap any malevolent spirit within the grave. So there you were, a perfectly healthy medieval villager who just needed a good night's rest, being lowered into the ground by your well-meaning but terribly misguided neighbors. And as you slowly came to, you'd find yourself buried alive, surrounded by the very superstitions that put you there. Nothing quite like waking up to find out you've become a victim of medieval paranoia. In the Middle Ages, certain medical conditions could easily be mistaken for death, and catalepsy was one of the most notorious culprits. Catalepsy is a condition characterized by a trance or seizure, with a loss of sensation and consciousness accompanied by rigidity of the body. To the untrained eye of a medieval villager, someone in a cataleptic state looked just like a corpse. Imagine this. You're sitting down for a meal, and suddenly you fall into a cataleptic state. Your family, familiar with medieval medicine, which is to say not at all, immediately panics. They try the usual remedies, splashing water on your face, slapping your cheeks, maybe even a pinch or two. When none of these sophisticated techniques work, they assume the worst. You've kicked the bucket. With no heartbeat detectable, because who in the Middle Ages knew how to check for one properly? Your loved ones begin preparing for your funeral. The village priest arrives, muttering prayers, and the undertaker, eager to finish before supper, starts digging your grave. Before you know it, you're laid to rest, still very much alive but unable to move or protest. Catalepsy wasn't the only condition that could lead to a premature burial. Epilepsy, narcolepsy, and severe fevers could all induce states of unconsciousness that medieval folks, with their rudimentary medical knowledge, would often misinterpret as death. The Middle Ages were rife with wars and battles, making life as unpredictable as the local weather. Whether it was knights clashing in grand tournaments or soldiers fighting in bloody skirmishes, the battlefield was a chaotic place where the line between life and death was often blurred. Imagine you're a soldier in the midst of a fierce battle. Amidst the clashing swords and flying arrows, you take a hit and fall unconscious. Your comrades, in the heat of the moment, can't stop to check if you're alive or just knocked out. They've got their own necks to worry about. The medics, who are basically just guys with some herbs and a knife, take one look at you, see no obvious signs of life, and decide you're done for. In the aftermath of the battle, the cleanup crew arrives. Their job is to gather the fallen and prepare them for burial. With the pressure to clear the battlefield quickly and the lack of proper medical assessments, they often mistake the unconscious for the dead. The motto here was better buried than left behind. And in the rush to move on, they didn't have time for second opinions. So there you are, lying in a heap with the real casualties, slowly coming to. As you groggily open your eyes, you're met with the horrifying realization that you're about to be buried alive. Your fellow soldiers, thinking they're giving you a proper send-off, are actually sending you to a premature grave. In these grim times, a bump on the head could turn into a one-way ticket to the afterlife, or at least a very close call. If you were lucky, you'd wake up in time to shout, wave, or at least make enough noise to alert the gravediggers. If not, well, let's just say medieval battles had more than their fair share of posthumous surprises. In the Middle Ages, religious beliefs and practices were as deeply rooted as the castles and cathedrals that dotted the landscape. The line between divine will and medical reality was often blurred, leading to some rather hasty burials. Imagine you're living in a village where the local priest holds as much power as the king. If you fall into a deep sleep or coma, the priest, armed with his holy texts and fervent beliefs, might interpret your state as a sign from God. Perhaps you're being called to the afterlife, or maybe you're possessed by a demon. Either way, the solution is clear. A swift burial to either send your soul to heaven or to prevent any demonic shenanigans. Religious customs often dictated that the dead be buried quickly to ensure their souls didn't linger and potentially cause trouble for the living. With the priest's blessing and the community's consent, your burial might be expedited faster than a medieval church service. The fear of the supernatural was rampant. If you were suspected of being cursed or possessed, your family and neighbors might rush to bury you, hoping to appease the higher powers and avoid any bad luck. The belief was that the longer a body remained unburied, the greater the risk of spiritual unrest. So there you are, peacefully comatose, being prepared for burial rites you're not quite ready for. Your loved ones, chanting prayers and lighting candles, genuinely believe they're doing you a favor by ensuring your swift passage to the afterlife. Little do they know, you're more interested in waking up for breakfast than any heavenly banquet. Waking up to find yourself in a coffin, surrounded by religious symbols and the muffled sounds of hymn singing, must have been a terrifying realization. Your first thought? I wasn't ready for this holy departure. Your second? How do I get out of here without causing a miracle panic? It was a situation where faith and fear could quite literally bury you alive.